Hello, everybody. I'll be talking about the freedom of science and its enemies. And what comes in the next half an hour is the question, does the better argument count? And I will then be talking about the threefold revolution or revolt against its origins, the twofold pressure on science, and the question, why do we need politically independent science, the liberation of science, and of course give some conclusions. Now, for the sources I use, you can see the outline in English that is distributed for the talk, and also for those who speak German, you can have a look at my book, Die Freie Gesellschaft und ihre Feinde, that is available at professorenforum.de. So let us start with the question, does the better argument count? What we all observe, I guess, is nothing new that I can tell you. We observe cancel culture, we observe political correctness, we observe accusations of racism, discrimination, anti-feminism, populism, and what you can think of if we deviate from one sort of mainstream view or views. And this development targets not only the humanities, but also the sciences. And even as I read just a week or two ago, mathematics is accused of white supremacy and must be freed from requirements of objectivity, which is a very strange approach for me as a physicist, which is based on mathematics, of course. And in February this year, a network for the freedom of science started in the German-speaking world, not only Germany, but also Austria. And it's called Netzwerk Wissenschaftsfreiheit. You have the homepage here. And it started with a significant media coverage. There was, as an example, a newspaper article in our Bremen local newspaper, Das freie Wort auf der Fahne, the free word on the flag. And that was an article where a journalist collected several statements of this network and of the people who were opposing this network. And he started with a quote of mine where I was saying the better argument counts regardless of who it comes from. And then later in this article, he quoted the response of the head of the local general student committee. And this guy said, local members of the networks, such as me, should carefully consider the company they associate with and which right-wing populist discourse on cancel culture they fuel. And then he said, anyone who is serious to stand up for freedom of science is definitely wrong here. Now, he didn't really give an explanation why I was seriously wrong here, but he confirmed what I was saying, that if you deviate from a certain mainstream direction, then you are accused of right-wing populism and things like that. So basically, he said I was right in what I was saying. I don't know if he realized that, but he used the usual things to give this whole movement of freedom sort of a bad connotation. Now, there is a threefold revolt, and I want to talk about this revolt and about its origins. And this revolt is against truth, it's against reason, and finally, it's against science itself. And the question is, where does it come from? Now, Douglas Murray, a journalist who is not a Christian, wrote a book a while ago, which is entitled The Strange Death of Europe. And in his book, he says, instead of being inspired by the spirit of truth and the search for the great questions, the continent's philosophers have instead become entrenched by how to avoid questions. And it seems not only the philosophers. Indeed, avoidance of great issues sometimes seems to have become the sole business of philosophy. In its place is an obsession with the difficulties of language and a distrust of all fixed things. The desire to question everything in order to never get to anywhere appears to be the point. Perhaps in order to defang both words and ideas for fear of where both might lead. And I think this is a very true statement, the fear of where truth might lead. The search for meaning is not new. What is new is that almost nothing in modern European culture appears itself to offering an answer. That was Douglas Murray in 2017. Now, the Bible is fairly clear about these kind of arguing, which doesn't get anywhere. In 2 Timothy, it says, don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments because you know they produce quarrels. Now another voice, a Christian voice, even 10 years ago, Vishal Mangalwadi published his book, The Book That Made Your World, and the book is the Bible that made your world, which is Europe. So he, as an Indian scholar, looks at Europe and at the roots of Europe. And he says, hope and confidence that the human spirit can overcome obstacles were defining features of modern Western civilization. But now secular West is unsure if the human spirit even exists, except as a word. And having rejected the divine logos as its foundation, now the West is unsure if language has anything to do with truth. Secular universities have blocked the West from truth. So that was 10 years ago, and things have developed. And a much older voice is that of Karl Popper. Karl Popper is a well-known philosopher. He's not a Christian, but he is a very wise guy, I'd say. And in 1945, he published his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And there he said, the abandonment of the rationalist attitude, of the respect for reason and argument and the other fellow's point of view, the stress upon the deeper, he means emotional layers of human nature, all this must lead to a view that though the thought is merely a somewhat superficial manifestation of what lies within these irrational depths. And its consequence is, it must nearly always, I believe, produce an attitude which considers the person of the thinker instead of his thought. And that's exactly the point where we are. If you say something that is not sufficiently mainstream, then people don't argue about what you said. They argue about why you said it, because you are white, male, European, or whatever. And then they come to the conclusion, because you come from this and that background, it's not worth to think about your thoughts, and then your arguments are just wiped off the table. And the consequence is bitter. He said it must produce the belief that we think with our blood, or with our national heritage, or with our class. And once we have done this, political equalitarianism becomes practically impossible. What he says, basically, democracy becomes impossible. Why? Because thinking with our national heritage is abandoning rational arguments and opening the path for fascism. With our class, with our national heritage, or with our class, with nationalism and with communism. So this kind of thinking, this kind of emotions open the way to political extremism, but not to freedom and democracy. Now, the German Research Foundation, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, in 2019 published guidelines for safeguarding good research practice. And in this research practice and this document, they say, amongst a lot of other statements, research is based, among other criteria, on rigorously questioning all findings and permitting and promoting critical discourse within the research community. So this critical discourse is one of the foundations of science. And science requires to be open for its outcomes, wherever these outcomes lead to. So science is dead, on the other hand, if political correctness or ideology dictates possible outcomes. Science is also dead if fear of mobbing, damage of reputation influences the outcome. or if possibility of publication depends on the desirability of results. And finally, undesirable results lead to defunding. If that happens, then science is dying. Now it's a question, where does it come from? And here I can give you only a short glimpse. I have talked about that more in the seminar I gave yesterday. But yeah, where does it come from? And I refer back to Karl Marx and his creative great-grandchildren. And the question in communism, in this kind of thinking, is how do you create a new just world? And the answer that classical Marxism gives is that there is a struggle for the means of production, and there has to be a violent revolution up to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, the neo-Marxist movement that starts from the Frankfurt School before the Second World War and after the war especially, said we have to change the culture of a society to bring about a revolution. As a next step then, post-Marxists left said, we use the actual or supposed injustice for revolution, suppressed minorities, colonialism, inequalities, queer ideology, and so on. So, of course, there are injustices, but the emphasis here on using or abusing these injustices for a revolution. And this trend has gone so far that today left politics has become a substitute for religion. It's a purification of consciousness through moral superiority. I will give examples for that. So today we have sort of a class struggle 2.0. So you all know the classical class struggle, I call that 1.0. It says liberation of the oppressed working class through revolution has to take place. Now, the creation of a revolutionary consciousness of the working class is the duty of the party, the left party, the Communist Party, or whatever they name themselves. Now there's a problem. The working class has a row house, a Mercedes-Benz, and is on vacation on Mallorca. So the working class is no longer suitable for revolution. So we have to look for new ones. So that comes, that leads to class struggle 2.0. There are many oppressed minorities. There are women, although they are not a minority. There are low-wage earners. They are unemployed. There are refugees, LGBT people, and whatever you might think of. And there may be oppression or not. That's another question. But the point is that there are many minorities which can be used for fostering a revolution. And the task of left politics is to make the oppressed aware of their oppression and use alleged or actual injustice to reshape society. Now, how does it work? It's a broad field, and I only want to stress one point, which is identity politics, because that's very upfront today, and it's very strong in replacing arguments by emotions. Identity politics means that identity of a person is defined through the belonging to minorities. So you may be a refugee, you may be whatever kind of person, and your identity is basically this being, for example, a refugee. Then the idea goes that minorities are victims, are always victims, no matter how successful or unsuccessful they are. And victims have to demand compensation because they have the status of being victims. They have to demand compensation. And from where? From the majority society. There is a purification agenda. The majority society must repent for having all these privileges, and they can do so by providing support to victims, that may be financially or ideally, and purification through repentance. They have to acknowledge their own wrongful status. Now, this leads, of course, to a division of society in victims, which are kept passive. Victims are not told to have a good education, to get a good education, to learn language or whatever there is, but they are told, no, You can't do anything. The others have to do things for you. And so they are kept passive, and the guilty majority feels, of course, unfair treated because they say, why should we subsidize others? It's not fair. And this is a spiral with no end. There is no end in sight. There's more and more structural discrimination, and this discrimination or structural discrimination requires regulation, quota, and also new or other science. So with this in mind, I want to describe the twofold pressure on science. Now we know, or we see where this pressure comes from. It comes from outside, but it also comes from inside. Now, from outside, we have the scientific environment. Science is not isolated. We have ideologically infiltrated parts of social or cultural studies, and they require obedience to their doctrines. Although they say there is no truth, they require obedience to what they say. And left extremist groups, they use violence or they threaten to use violence, Antifa and so on. Now, and there are also student representatives that try to prevent talks or publications or whatever. And there is a biased, or in many cases, a biased media coverage, which is in line with the current political mainstream. Now, there is also institutional pressure. University rectorates often do not protect colleagues against attacks. And there is an increasing flood of regulations, which are quite far-reaching in their influence beyond a particular subject or project. So the European Union funding requires gender equality measures across all areas of science. It's very far-reaching. And every course of study must be accredited. It's a question of what for? Is this really necessary? Now, all in all, non-scientific criteria and political one-sidedness are increasingly becoming an instrument of power to direct science. And here it's not about truth, it's just about power. So, pressure from within. Advanced obedience becomes a pre-filter of what can be said. Particularly young scientists fear to ruin their careers. Self-censorship increases. I hear something like, do I get a professorship or a project if I don't use gender-sensitive language? Can I publish anything that criticizes aspects of the long-term depths of the EU, measures against COVID pandemic, accuracy of climate models, migration, gender views, quota, and so on and so on? I don't think that all these things are wrong. The point I want to make is that we have an open discussion on alternatives. And if people fear to put their alternatives on the table, then science dies. The pressure conformity comes increasingly from inside, and people are getting used to absurdities. I once got the answer in a discussion of someone saying, we are used to answering nonsense with nonsense. And of course, that's not good for science. There is a lack of open discussion beyond one's own area of expertise. There is the isolated expert who is the expert in his particular field, but there is not much exchange in terms of questioning overall strategies or questioning the question, the point of use that is being put on people. A very important point is here that basic funding decreases and the competition for funding ever increases. And this is a measure of share and divide and reign, that as people have always to be in harsh competition about funding, they can be guided much easier as if they would have their basic funding and just could do the research they wanted to do. So this characterizes sort of the situation that we find at universities usually. Now one could ask, why do we need independent science? Why do we need politically independent science? And the question is actually fairly simple. what is the value of science for society? And there are three dangers to be confronted. Science is a substitute or becomes a substitute for political decision-making, or science becomes a justification for ideologically based decision-making. So an example, science can give no justification for a specific restructuring of the whole society according to a socially just reshaping. As the only appropriate response to climate change, there may be other and better solutions than going into an eco-socialism. And the other danger is damage of the economic strength of our country or of our countries as a consequence of decline of natural and engineering science. So the reference to science, to scientific results, is often made to end any further discussion. But science does not deliver ultimate truth, as progress of science shows. And science does not deliver normative truth. So science can say, okay, if you do this, or if you do that, then this and that will happen, but it cannot tell you what is the normative right way to go. That is another discussion. And critical and controversial public discussion is mandatory for that purpose. Also, scientists need to clearly distinguish between scientific statements from within their field and of expertise and personal opinions, and this is often mixed up. So society needs independent science, and otherwise science degrades to an expensive source of justification for politics, and that is something in the end which you do not need. Now, talking about liberation, what can we do about this situation? There's a liberation of mind, liberation of speech, and liberation of action. In Romans 12, it says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by renewing of our mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is good and pleasing and perfect will. We may have gotten very much used to this, so I rephrase it or have it rephrased by another prominent philosopher, Alvin Plantinga. He's a Christian philosopher who wrote a paper called Advice to Christian Philosophers already in 1984, and he said, the Christian philosopher has its own topics and projects to think about. And when he thinks about the topics of current concern, he will think about them in his own way, which may be a different way. He may have to reject certain currently fashionable assumptions, and the Christian philosopher has a perfect right to the point of view and pre-philosophical assumptions he brings to philosophic work. The fact that these are not widely shared outside the Christian community is interesting, but fundamentally irrelevant. So many Christians think that they have to adopt presuppositions that come from the outside world, that come from atheists or agnostic points of view. But that's not necessary. Everyone has the right to start with their own assumptions and presuppositions, and so should we. And if we start with foreign presuppositions, then we will fail in justifying or arguing for the Christian case and for other cases as well. So if we have this freedom in our mind to pick our own presuppositions, our own ideas, then the next step is the liberation of speech. I don't know if you know about the conformity experiments of Solomon Asch. They're fairly old, from the 1950s. And what he did is he asked test subjects to assess the length of lines. Similar to that, what you see on the right side, there are 3 lines, and he asked them which line on the right side has the same length as the one on the left side. Now you may think, oh, this is a fairly simple task, but of course there was a trick coming with it. The setting was that there is only one real test person and the others were instructed how to answer. Of course, the real test person didn't know that the others were fake test persons, but it goes in a way that if the behavior of the instructed person was that all give a wrong answer, so 3 or 4 persons all give the wrong answer, then the portion of the test persons who gave an obviously wrong answer was 37%. So more than 1/3 of the real test persons were giving an obviously wrong answer only because all the people before were giving the wrong answer. That's very amazing because it was not dangerous also to give the wrong answer. They were just giving the wrong answer. Now, he changed the setting, and he instructed one of the fake test persons to give the correct answer. So there were 3 or 4 persons giving the wrong answer, and one of them were giving the correct answer. Now, the portion of test persons who gave an obviously wrong answer dropped to 5%. And while the first result is sort of frightening, the second result is very encouraging, because if you sit in an audience or if you sit in a group and discuss things, and you are the one who brings up another opinion and does not agree with this mainstream of the other persons, then you liberate the other persons also to express their alternative views. So bringing up other statements, or sometimes even better, bringing up good questions, is a very good measure to liberate the atmosphere in a discussion or on a podium or wherever the setting is. Then another thing that's going to happen, or that's happening, is that more and more details of oppression of freedom are documented. Already in mid-2019, a book, Die Freiheit der wissenschaftlichen Feinde, the freedom of science and its enemies, came up. And the foreword was written from Bernhard Kempen, who is the president of the German Association of University Professors and Lecturers. And he said, the search for truth and knowledge thrives on the passionate, fierce, and controversial struggle of theses, facts, arguments, and evidence. And universities must remain places for free and open discourse. And competing opinions must be respected and endured. You may say, okay, that's trivial, but it is a time where this kind of statement is not trivial anymore. And it comes from someone who has a certain weight in the academic scenery in Germany. And then another thing happened, and there I come back to the beginning of my talk. The Netzwerk Wissenschaftsfreiheit, the network Freedom of Science, went public in February this year with 70 members. I was one of the founding members and arrived at 465 members just a couple of days ago. And if you go to this homepage, you find a manifest, and this manifest has statements like, we observe that the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of research and teaching is increasingly being placed under moral and political reservations. And when members of the scientific community avoid research questions out of fear of the social and professional costs, or avoid debates, the prerequisites for free science erodes. And that's exactly the point, and more people are willing to speak that out publicly, which is, of course, a good point. Now, let me come to the conclusions. What did we learn? There's a threefold revolt against truth, against reason, and science. And this undermines the foundation of Christian faith, the science, economy, and a free society altogether. And the pressure on science of most in the Western world is predominantly from originating from a post-Marxist ideology in disguise. It's now being internalized through anticipatory obedience, and in order to go against this, we need a liberation of one's own mind that enables the recovery of rational reasoning and allows for free speech and correcting interventions. Damaging freedom of science damages justification for science at all, and finally, the society is damaged as a whole. So society needs independent science, otherwise science degrades to an expensive source of justification for politics, and Christians should be engaged in restoring freedom for themselves and for others. So, as I said, the resources of the talk are given in the outline and in the books that you can find at professorenforum.de Bücher. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.